Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Today, what we're going to discuss are the start of political parties. This is part of a larger unit, which will include media and also special interest groups. These organizations, political parties, special interest groups, and media, are all known as linkage institutions. Linkage institutions are organizations that connect people to the government. Linkage institutions are organizations that connect people to the government. In this case, we're going to look at political parties today and discuss how parties have changed over time and what are the importance of political parties on the American political landscape. Political parties are merely a group of people that's main goal is to elect candidates. Their main goal is to elect candidates to control the government. Um, Generally, political parties serve on a couple different levels. One, they give people an identification. They give political candidates an identification. In today's time, generally either Republican or Democrat. It supplies that candidate with a label, and it gives that candidate an apparatus, a background, as we'll see, of an organizational campaign effort to get elected to office. Um, in the United States, when you go in and vote, you will see um, candidates, political parties listed with their office. So you will go in and you will see that President Obama had Democrat next to his name. Former President George W. Bush had Republican next to his. The United States um, has some of the oldest political parties in the world, if not the oldest political parties. Um, they have altered their role in recent years. Political parties are not the power they used to be in many cases. A lot of power, as we discussed in our campaigns and election unit, has given way to an industry of media consultants, pollsters, and admin. And what you see here is parties have adapted to their new roles as linkage institutions and trying to get that candidate elected. Um, Looking across the United States, uh, you do have geographic parties that have popularity only in one geographic location, and we do have political parties that continue to uh, develop in even in a time period when you have political parties losing some ground in control of elections. Most recently, in presidential election, we had the 2000 with Ralph Nader, who ran as a third party as the Green Party. He received 2 million popular votes in that election with no electoral votes, though. What we see here is that uh, political parties have give candidates a label. And that label today with voters describing themselves as a Republican or Democrat has actually weakened in recent years. Uh, Generally, if you look at the 19th century, party identification was very strong. Now, there's probably reasons for that, such as political bosses, some would refer to as political corruption, and no secret or Australian ballot where everybody knew how you were voting. But we start to see in more modern times um, that in the 1950s, we generally see that there is a strong identification with parties, and that you see about 36% of people strongly identify to one party or another. Generally, you saw that 22% of Democrats um, strongly identified, 14% of people identified as Republicans, and 23% of people said they were independent. And usually independents tend to lean towards one side and are not truly independent. In 2004, a new survey was taken, and Generally, we have seen that identification has slightly lessened from 36% in the um, 1952 survey to 33% in the 2004. The area we have seen the most growth of is that people who describe themselves as independent or not loyal to one party or another. This also goes to a phenomenon we're going to discuss a little later in this lecture, which is in regards to ticket splitting, where people are voting for both Democrat and Republican candidates, and possibly even third party candidates. Uh, Generally, you look at here a set of leaders, they need to organize. And parties do not only serve as a linkage institution for people to connect to the government, but they serve as a pivotal way we organize the legislative branch. The party that wins the most votes controls the legislative branch and sets up those leadership positions in Congress, in the House and Senate. It also is going to set the mode for the party platform, what they want to try to get accomplished in the 2 or 6 or 4 years they're in office. And generally, you have to understand political parties come with a wide array of political views. And this is where they are known as a coalition. Political parties form coalitions. Um, they are groups of people who associate with a political party because they have something that person can associate with their beliefs. It may be several issues, it may be one issue, it may be the entire platform. But political parties come with coalitions of people. And because of that, keeping a party together and united for one candidate can be very difficult. And as we're seeing in the 2016 election, uh, there are major divisions of what people view as a good candidate in these primaries. There are a slew of candidates right now with the Republican in the 2016 election. And in the Democratic side, you have two candidates who are identifying themselves as very differently in some cases. Um, when you look at European parties, a little comparative politics to uh, the United States, European political parties in general have a strong party identification. In the US, we know candidates. We don't necessarily vote along that's a Republican or that's a Democrat. It's almost the opposite in Europe. In Europe, it's about the party. If you're not going to be a party loyalist, you're not going to get the nomination. Um, and generally, this is somewhat of a new phenomenon where you can be an individual in the US rather than the party. Um, and we also see that the US as a government, because of our federal system, where we have that division between the state government and the federal government and even the local government, our parties are also organized on the same way as our federal government today, where you have the different levels. And it's not a top down relationship. Our political parties in the United States really are a bottom to top relationship, which differs greatly from our European countries, which are a top down and more centralized and nationalized party system, but they also have a more centralized and nationalized government overall. Uh, we have seen in recent years that political parties have become more heavily regulated by laws. This can be on the state level, and this can also be on the federal level, depending on the exact acts. Uh, Today, we select our candidates through primary elections. Um, that is different also in European countries. Generally, the European party leaders pick the candidates and not necessarily the voters, that they give the party nominations to the voters in the general election. Um, We have seen in the U.S. a shift, you could say, that there is a more centralized government today, where the federal government is more powerful than the state government. But parties have not made that same shift. Parties still remain extremely um, localized in their power from that bottom up relationship. Another difference you see in European government and parties is that most of the European countries run on a parliamentary system, unlike the US, where the prime minister or chief executive is chosen not by the people, as we elect the president in the United States, but they are chosen by the party members of parliament, and that the prime minister, the chief executive in European nations is often part of parliament, the legislative branch, and is picked by the people in the legislative branch. During our nation's history, we have seen the political party landscape change. Today, we know them as the Republicans and Democrats, and occasionally a third party. But throughout our history, we have seen a variety of parties through different time periods, and some have come and gone ultimately. As we go back to our founding, as you probably recall from your American history class last year, political parties were more or less called factions during that time. And, the founding fathers really feared these developments of political factions. And our first two political factions were generally the Federalists and then the Democratic Republicans, sometimes referred to as the anti Federalists. Generally, by 1800, though, the Federalist Party had been beaten so badly nationally and in most states that they had died out. The Democratic Republicans had dominated uh, the political landscape. And for a time, this seemed to unite things. And even in one particular point, the founding fathers, as Weiss stated, Washington feared the political factions and warned in his farewell address of them. And by the time James Monroe is elected in the era of good feelings, there is no opposition whatsoever to his election. This all begins to change during the Jacksonian era, during the time Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, is elected, to the Civil War. We enter into our second era of political parties. We see that this lasts from about 1824 to roughly 1865 through the late 1860s. We also see during this time that political participation increases greatly, from the hundreds of thousands in 1824 to by 1840, over 2 million people are participating in our elections. And of course, these are primarily white males, the difference being property requirements have just been lifted. A little comparative view, in England at the same time in the 1800s, only 650,000 people could vote, in who were qualified to vote in England. So our suffrage, our right to vote in the United States, even though limited in the 1800s, was significantly higher and more inclusive than many European countries. We also see that during this time, politics became an entertainment for the American people. One of the things that we saw during this time is that we operated on the caucus system. This is a little different than the caucus systems we have today. We just recently witnessed in the 2016 election in Iowa. These are more of the congressional caucuses that came together to select candidates. It's not so much the people en masse, but rather the legislative branches coming to nominate political candidates. This ran into significant problems by 1824 and became very unpopular, mainly because In 1824, the caucus selected the third most popular candidate. And Andrew Jackson at the time was extremely popular, but ultimately loses the election to John Quincy Adams, but wins the popular vote. Again, this is a good example too of how some people have issues with the Electoral College, which we discussed in our last unit in campaigns and elections, the John Quincy Adams election of 1824. The caucus system is replaced by a new system that we still have today, and it is known as a convention system. That each political party, Democrat and Republican today, would hold their own convention that have delegates that are selected in some manner who are going to pick the candidate. The first convention to be held was by the Anti-Masonic Party in 1831. Um, the second convention we're going to see is that anti-Jackson Republicans are going to nominate the great compromiser Henry Clay to be president. Um, Andrew Jackson is eventually going to run and get elected in 1832 as a Democrat. Um, Generally, what we see is during this era, Democrats, and um, these are different than modern day Democrats, dominated the air. Particularly, they dominated the area of Westerners, Southerners, new immigrants in America. And the other side of the coin were the Whig Party during this time of Jacksonian politics, 1824 through the 1860s, which really were the Northern industrialists for a time and Southern planters. The problem and next period in our political landscape, we said that the Jacksonian era lasts generally from 1824 to the 1860s. During the time of the Civil War in the late 1850s, we begin to see major splits along political parties. And the issue becomes slavery. How can we avoid slavery? How can we keep that off the party platform? How can we, in a sense, straddle the fence to keep all our voters on our side? New parties began to emerge, and one of those new parties becomes the Republican Party, which at the time was a third party, was categorized as a third party, and is eventually going to take out the Whig Party. And we're going to see our modern parties develop, though different alignments, the Republicans and Democrats. Um, Generally, we are also going to see, once the Republicans are in office and are are one of the main two parties, are going to dominate politics for about 3/4 of a century. Generally, the Confederacy will go to the Democrats, the South will vote Democratic, and the North and even the West will go to the Republicans. Democrats will avoid the Republicans because they are the party of Lincoln. Um, the Republican Party is eventually going to run into its own problems by the late 1890s, 1896, and through the early 20th century, and they're going to run into the problem of being progressives or going to be known as the old guard. And the Republican Party is going to split along the factions of the stalwarts, which are the old guard, these are the political machines. Um, they build their loyalty up by party patronage. You support me, and I'll give you a job type of ideal there. The opposite side would be what are known as the mugwumps or the progressives, and these would be the reformers. These would be the people who are against um, political party machinery and are for free trade. We're also going to see a little problem with the Democrats around the 1890s with a candidate known as Williams Jennings Bryan, who is going to start to split the Democratic Party also and form a really third party known as the Populist, which you may also recall from your American history class. This concludes part one of our lecture on political parties. We'll pick back up with the Reform Era and party realignment in part two.